Alright, I have been wanting to make this video for a long time, which means inevitably, I will not do it justice. Because the more you think about something, sometimes the more tangled up your thoughts become. But I do have one benefit here. I'm talking about a book that I have taught several times. And the essence of this book is an aesthetic essay by a Japanese author, Junichiro Tanizaki. Now, I said that as though I knew how to pronounce it, but I don't actually know how to pronounce it. I did take a semester of Japanese, to which I learned valuable phrases like inu wa doku ni imasu ka. But the professor was very quick to point out that I had a severe case of Tennessee tongue, which meant that I could not pronounce very well things in Japanese that were in any conflict at all with my Tennessee accent, which were most things. We'll try to get to the heart of what is talked about in this book by Tanizaki in Praise of Shadows. I don't know if it's really just to call this a book. It's only about 60 pages long. It's more of an essay, but one of the things I really do like about it is it's not a treatise with a series of logical propositions. This is a book on aesthetics, which by itself is quite aesthetic to read, and Tanizaki is an author. He's a fiction writer. I don't think the book is meant to be read as an essay that, as it says in the Dada Manifesto, wants ABC to fulminate against 1, 2, 3. I should do Dada on here at some point. Instead, what you're getting is a poetic and beautiful description of the virtues of Japanese architecture by an author who is bemoaning the loss of the culture that he loves as Japan modernizes and westernizes. And he deftly weaves together an implicit argument, not only about architecture and about culture, but on the writing of stories and the crafting of narrative. And that's really what we're getting to, as it says in the title and the description. So what I want to do is just walk through the basic things, asking the question of what can we learn as people who craft stories, as write stories, as make comics, in my case, and what can I take away from this book on Japanese architecture that makes me better at these things. This is one of my absolute favorite essays on aesthetics. Find this at some point. Pick it up. It's not an expensive book either. Very much worth having in your library of aesthetics. So the book, In Praise of Shadows, was written in 1933, and Tanizaki is born in the late 19th century, and he lives up until the 60s, I think. 1964, I think, is when he dies. And so he is watching Japan go through this transition of westernization, industrial revolution, and an interest in technology that means broad adoption from the West, where much of that technology was being invented at the time. So just to give you a little section right here about the toilet, because the toilet is a famous part of it, I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts from it on the subject of the Japanese toilet. Every time I am shown to an old, dimly lit, and I would add impeccably clean toilet in a Nara or Kyoto temple, I am impressed with the singular virtues of Japanese architecture. The parlor may have its charms, but the Japanese toilet truly is a place of spiritual repose. It always stands apart from the main building, at the end of a corridor, in a grove fragrant with leaves and moss. So he's describing an outhouse. As a southerner, I can relate. No words can describe that sensation as one sits in the dim light, basking in the faint glow reflected from the shoji, lost in meditation or gazing out at the garden. I love to listen from such a toilet to the sound of softly falling rain, especially if it is a toilet in the Kanto region, with its long, narrow windows at floor level. There one can listen with such a sense of intimacy to the raindrops falling from the eaves and the trees, seeping into the earth as they wash over the base of a stone lantern and freshen the moss about the stepping stones, or to enjoy any of those poignant moments that mark the change of the seasons. Our forebears, making poetry of everything in their lives, transformed what by rights should be the most unsanitary room into the house into a place of unsurpassed elegance, replete with fond associations with the beauties of nature. Now, he does acknowledge here that the Japanese toilet, being apart from the house, is somewhat inconvenient, but he hits upon a major point that we're going to need for the rest of this discussion. So, let me give it to you. The Japanese toilet is, I must admit, a bit inconvenient to get to in the middle of the night, set apart from the main building as it is, and in winter, there's always a danger that one might catch cold. But as the poet Saito Ryoku, this is one of these moments where I can't say that. I can't say that name. Has said, elegance is frigid. Now see, that's very good. That's a superb point to ponder on, is the way in which the toilet in all of its aesthetic glory, as described by Tanizaki, demands of the person who uses it a sacrifice. Because elegance is frigid, and there's a certain amount of distance and suffering that elegance and aesthetic demands of the person who uses it. See, that's important. We're going to need that to help understand things as we go further in, because that is a key component. See, a lot of what Tanizaki is complaining about the upcoming Japanese generation is that they have been tainted by a Western desire for convenience. Now, he blames this on the Westerners, and there probably is an argument to be made there. In reading this multiple times, it seems that most of his ire is really directed towards the young Japanese, because he's talking about this influx of technology and the change that accompanies it. Let me give you an example. When it comes to the changing of the culture around Tanizaki, he has numerous complaints. Most of them are related to the concepts of light. As he says in an earlier portion here, as a general matter, we, meaning the Japanese, find it hard to be really at home with things that shine and glitter. And so he has a real bone to pick with any kind of technology that interrupts this. Like, for example, electricity, which Tanizaki does feel is causing some issues, or in the very least, it's asking for sacrifices in the name of convenience. So you could make the argument both directions and say, elegance is frigid. It requires of us a little bit of suffering in order to endure it. You could also flip that the other direction and then say that convenience very frequently, if not always, I'd have to think about it before I'd be willing to say always, demands that we sacrifice aesthetic and that we sacrifice something impractical yet valuable in order to achieve that convenience. So it's never just pure acquisition, it's just exchange. So here is what Tanizaki says on the subject of electricity versus candlelight. There is a famous restaurant in Kyoto, the Warangia, one of the attractions of which was until recently that the dining rooms were lit by candlelight rather than electricity. But when I went there this spring after a long absence, the candles had been replaced by electric lamps in the style of old lanterns. Several of their customers had complained that candlelight was too dim and that they had been left no choice. But if I preferred the old way, they should be happy to bring me a candlestick. Since this is what I had come for, I asked them to do so, and I realized then that only in the dim half-light is the true beauty of Japanese lacquerware revealed. You know, it's kind of interesting when you read a statement like that about the fact that they were still willing to bring him a candlestick, just because at this point that's no longer the case. And this is one of the issues with convenience that Tanizaki doesn't necessarily address directly in this essay, but rather you start to see crop up after the fact, is that very frequently the conveniences are added, technologies are added, with the presupposition that, well, if you want this, you could do it this way, take the convenience, and for those who want to still do it the traditional way, you're still welcome to do that. However, societies tend to really only move one direction collectively, and they tend to go with a majority, because if I do something like run a restaurant and eventually I've got to remodel and I'm trying to ensure that everything runs as efficiently as it possibly can, eventually it's going to become nearly impossible for a customer to eat by candlelight. So these kinds of cultural changes tend to sweep everything along with it. That's really an aside for the larger thesis of this. I've just been thinking about that. So you might be thinking, after hearing that previous section anyway, about eating by candlelight, in a restaurant. You know, maybe this guy is just attached to what is familiar, and he doesn't want to give up what's familiar. And so in order to make an argument that there's something of value here besides just subjective opinion, he's going to have to make a case for something a little bit more substantive. And he does that on the subject of shadows themselves. This is when he begins kind of in earnest talking about the architecture of homes. And he talks about a few things such as how the eaves of a Japanese house tend to stick way out over the edge of the home, and that causes a lot of shadows to be cast. Whereas in Western homes, there's a tendency to try and allow in as much light as possible, which this is actually very true in the way that we design homes. But even in the Middle Ages, churches started to be designed at the beginning of the Gothic period with a concept of the theology of light. Essentially, light is a representative of, as well as genuinely tinged with, a virtuous and divine element. And thus, a church should want to let in as much light as possible. And it should allow as much of the church to be struck by light as can. And that has led to some truly beautiful pieces of Gothic architecture, of which personally I have a tremendous passion. The Gothic is my favorite architectural movement. But he is offering up an alternative here of a different kind of perspective on light and shadow. See, Japanese homes were never particularly decorated, especially not in the kind of homes that were lower or middle class, depending on how that manifested in any given period of Japanese history. They tended to have sort of light beige walls. They tended to have lots of paper window as opposed to glass, and doors would be open to allow light in. But again, those heavy eaves are going to cause lots of shadows to come in. And one of the things that you tend to perceive those shadows as in this context of somewhat minimalist decoration is the shadows become something of a decoration in of themselves. He even says here, and so it has come to be that the beauty of a Japanese room depends on a variation of shadows, heavy shadows against light shadows. It has nothing else. Westerners are amazed at the simplicity of Japanese rooms, perceiving in them no more than ashen walls bereft of ornament. The reaction is understandable, but it betrays a failure to comprehend the mystery of shadows. I mean, we have actually seen modern examples of that. There's a famous Frank Lloyd Wright house that uses shadows that create patterns on the walls as the position of the sun changes throughout the year. The idea of a shadow forming something of the decoration is kind of broadly acknowledged across cultures, but Tanizaki seems to be arguing it has a very special significance in the case of the Japanese. So let's hear him talk about the way in which you interact with these shadows. A Japanese room might be likened to an inkwash painting. This is a great comparison for one thing, because inkwash paintings have this kind of monochrome contrast to them, which is rather like shadow and light. So hold that image in your mind as we go through and read a little bit further into this. Whenever I see the alcove of a tastefully built Japanese room, I marvel at our comprehension of the secrets of shadows. For the beauty of the alcove is not the work of some clever device. An empty space is marked off with plain wood and plain walls, so that the light drawn into it forms dim shadows within emptiness. There's nothing more. And yet, when we gaze into the darkness that gathers behind the crossbeam, though we know perfectly well it is mere shadow, we are overcome with the feeling that in this small corner of the atmosphere there reigns complete and utter silence. That here in the darkness a mutable tranquility holds sway. When I was small, we lived in a house that had a big brick fireplace, and I would lay on the couch across from that fireplace, and I would hang over backwards, upside down, and I would stare at that fireplace, just kind of letting my eyes push over the contours of every brick. And as you look at brick, you start to realize that it's so far from being a clean edge or a clean surface. You know, there's all these individual mountains that grow up on them. Of course, from our scale, they just look like little bumps, but you spend time looking at it and thinking about it, and it becomes like a mountain range. And then in your mind, you transfer yourself into this tiny size and imagine yourself climbing over these mountains, thinking of each and every one as something much more substantive than just a bit of texture on the side of brick. This is the kind of thing that I imagine when I read this section, because he's describing a child in a different culture doing very much the same thing, sitting and observing some inanimate aspect of the home and finding in it something mysterious and something powerful that is extraordinarily easy to overlook, or, as he says here, to destroy. And even we as children could feel an inexpressible chill as we peered into the depths of an alcove to which the sunlight had never penetrated. Where lies the key to this mystery? Ultimately, it is in the magic of shadows, were the shadows to be banished from its corners. The alcove would, in that instant, revert to a mere void. That's incredible. And that's incredible because of the implications that come along with it. So if I have a corner of the room and it's filled with shadow, and I stare into that corner, feeling the inexpressible chill of the mystery of that darkness, the fact that this is a home with no electricity, where that corner has never been seen by me. The room has never been illuminated to fill that corner. And that if I were to shed a light on it, the mystery that was created would dissipate. And there would be nothing left. And the mystery would be gone with it. Now, at this point, you may definitely be thinking, what in heaven's name does this have to do with writing? And what does it have to do with storytelling? And the answer to that is, it is forthcoming. To be fair, I've already given you most of it, but I will give you more of it, and it will slowly become clearer. So trust me on this, if you trust me. I really wouldn't, but you should. So let's hit upon one more piece before we then bring it to its conclusion, and somewhat help to reveal how this applies to storytelling, which is really the direction that Tanizaki is coming from, and the way he's arguing this point is demonstrative of the point that he's making. Why should this propensity to seek beauty in darkness be so strong only in Orientals? The West, too, has known a time when there was no electricity, gas, or petroleum, and yet, so far as I know, the West has never been disposed to delight in shadows. We prefer colors compounded of darkness. They prefer the colors of sunlight and of silver and copperware. We love them for the burnish and the patina, which they consider unclean, unsanitary, and polished to a glittering brilliance. But what produces such differences in taste? In my opinion, it is this, and this part is crucial as well, and understanding the point that he's making, because he's going to draw a distinction here between the West and the East. We tend to seek our satisfaction in whatever surroundings we happen to find ourselves, to content ourselves with things as they are. And so darkness causes us no discontent. We resign ourselves to it as inevitable. If light is scarce, then light is scarce, and we will immerse ourselves in the darkness and there discover its own particular beauty. So there's a concept here of being willing to accept one's context and surroundings. And if you're one of the sharp-eyed viewers or sharp-eared listeners, I suppose, then you might realize, well, this isn't something that's only distinct to Japanese philosophy or aesthetic. This is something you can find present in most philosophies of the ancient world. Self-denial is a key component. You know, this is clearly an aspect of Christianity, which says, take up your cross. You know, deny yourself daily, take up your cross, and follow me. And then also in something in terms of the sheer acceptance of one's environment, you can find this in things like Roman Stoicism. It's a common element. So what he's referring to here is a particular cultural manifestation But this is something that has been held as virtuous all over the world through much of human history. So what Tanizaki is getting at here might be a bit more open to interpretation than it comes across when he's just talking about contrast between cultures. But let's go to his last part here and think about how that conceivably virtuous aspect applies to the writing of stories. This is the very last bit from the book. I am aware of and most grateful for the benefits of this age. No matter what complaints we may have, Japan has chosen to follow the West, and there is nothing for it to do but move bravely ahead and leave us old ones behind. I have written all this because I have thought that there might still be somewhere, possibly in literature or the arts, where something could be saved. In the mansion called literature, I would have the eaves deep and the walls dark, and I would push back into the shadows the things that come forward too clearly, and I would strip away the useless decorations. I do not ask this to be done everywhere, but perhaps we may be allowed at least one mansion where we can turn off the electric lights and see what it is like without them. This is where Tanizaki does a bit of the work for us, and he actually tells us a little bit, anyway, of what he means by the connection between architecture and shadows and with literature and writing. And the interesting thing is, I believe that what he's criticizing is something that's far more egregious now than it was at the time he wrote it 90 years ago. In our writing, there's a great temptation towards total clarity. That with a narrative, nobody should walk away with any questions left at the end as to how the pieces fit together. In fact, the pieces are articulated with so much over-explanation. So frequently, the connections between the parts in a story and the purpose of a story and the meaning of a story and the message of a story are so over-explained that it's like shedding spotlights on every aspect of the narrative, when what seems to be advocated on the part of Tanizaki is restraint, an acceptance of not knowing for certain, in the very least. Now, this is a narrative element that I have seen frequently abused. When I was in college, it was really common for film students to make films that functionally just had no ending. They would just stop, and there was no ending to it. There was no resolution to it. And that seems like an extreme on the opposite side. What he's getting at is something that requires significant subtlety and precision. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that the whole essay of In Praise of Shadows might sound a little bit like rambling. It might sound a little bit like grumbling and grouching. But what's happening is throughout it, he's weaving together an argument for a way of thinking about the world. And then at the very end, he pulls us just a little bit into this idea of literature being filled with mystery, being filled with shadows that we can peer into without necessarily ripping it apart and examining it. And I'm not attempting to call out all of the YouTube channels that spend all of their time attempting to explain every single aspect of components of literature. Poor Tolkien. It sounded like I was criticizing. I'm not putting that out exactly, but it is kind of an amusing manifestation of this idea of nothing must be left unsaid. Everything must be known. It must be figured out. It must be clarified. Otherwise, you can't really have rest. Whereas Tanizaki is suggesting that the mystery is in some cases, and maybe even in many cases, the superior thing. Because when you shed light on that corner and you eliminate the shadows, it might be all that you find underneath is just an empty void. And maybe those shadows weren't actually concealing something in the corner, but maybe they were allowing the reader to orient themselves towards the things that those mysteries represent. So now I want to write with greater subtlety. So maybe I should try to leave some shadows in my work. I'll leave it to another time to figure out the difference between a plot hole and a shadow. But nonetheless, if you've listened this far, I greatly appreciate that. I appreciate the time that you give, and I hope that you glean something from it. I don't think I said any of this stuff at the beginning, so like the video and subscribe. All that stuff YouTube creators are intended to say at the end. And I'll see you hopefully in the next video. And for the time, genuinely, thank you for watching.